Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome once again to the new Yankee Workshop. Well, if your emails that you're sending our website are any indication, what you really want from us is how to build the woodworking jigs like this panel raising jig to make furniture like this. Well, your wish is going to come true, because for the next 2 episodes, we're going to build our favorite homemade jigs. That's next, right here on the new Yankee Workshop.
The new Yankee Workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram.
The other day I was building some drawers for our computer desk. In order to get nice square panels for the bottom, I turned to my homemade panel cutting jig. Now, I use this in the shop almost every day, and a lot of you have written to us and asked, show us how to build one. So I thought today would be a good time. Now, you can buy a commercially made panel cutter. They're expensive and they're heavy, and they have more features than I really need here in the workshop. The key is to have a very lightweight jig. You'll use it all the time because you won't be dealing with something that's heavy and bulky. Now, this jig was meant to ride on the left-hand side of the saw blade. I'm going to make a different version this time. I'm going to flip it around so that it's on the right-hand side of the saw blade. That'll give me full support. And it also means that the panel I'm cutting will be up against the fence, and as I push it through the saw blade, it'll stay nice and tight in position. Now, if you'd like to build this jig or any of the other new Yankee Workshop jigs, a measure drawing is available with a materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. To get started today, I'm going to cut a new piece of plywood, a little bit wider this time. So I've got some 1/2-inch cabinet-grade plywood. But before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now there, I've just ripped the panel to 21 inches wide. One of the key elements of this jig is the hardwood strip that's screwed to the plywood bottom. The fit of that piece in the miter gauge slot determines the accuracy of the jig. Now this one, after many years of use, has developed some slight play. I want a nice, snug fit. So the first thing to do is measure the slot. It will vary slightly from saw to saw. This one is just a little over 3/4 of an inch. So I have a piece of cherry that I've jointed one edge, and we'll rip a strip. And let's see how we are now. Yeah, still just a little bit tight, but you know, I think with a little lubrication on that, it'll be fine. Now for the thickness of the runner. I don't want it to be proud of the table surface, yet I want to get it as far into the slot as possible. That looks like about 3/8 of an inch. The next step is to locate the strip on the plywood bottom. Now the distance from the saw blade to the slot is 5.5 inches. I'm going to put a mark at 6.5 inches, and I'll trim the end after the runner is installed. Using a framing square, I'll put down my layout line, and I'll be ready to attach the runner. Now here I'm positioning the runner on my line with a couple spring clamps, and I want to take the square once again and slide it up against the back side to make sure it's nice and straight, and then I'll pre-drill for some screws. Now you'll notice I'm countersinking these because I don't want the screw to be proud of the runner. A few 3/4 inch screws will do the job holding it in place. Now we'll trim this edge, which will make it parallel to the runner. Now I can install the stop, which must be square to this edge, which means it's square to the saw itself. Now it should be flush with the back edge of the panel, but I'm going to take my framing square and just confirm that. Slide it back, hold it tight up against the square, and attach it with a couple brads, and then I'll permanently affix it with some screws. Once again, I have pre-drilled holes. this time for 1-inch screws. Okay, now I can trim off the stop. Now let's give it a test run. If I want to cut a panel, what I would do is mark my length along the back edge, and then slide it up against the fence and bring the pencil line right to the end of the stop. That way I know it's right even with the saw blade. And run it through. Now the true test, if I've got a perfectly square cut, is to take the panel, flip it over, slide the opposite edge up against the stop, and see if it's even with the end of the jig. And it is, so we know it's square. All right, well now I've drilled a hole in it to hang it up. And this is an important tip. Hang your jigs where you can get at them. If you can't get at them, you're not going to use them. A couple years ago, I built this kitchen secretary, which features raised panel construction on the drop front and on the ends. Now you can raise panels on a router table with a special bit, or you can raise them on a shaper. But if you have a table saw and the right jig, you can do the same thing. The jig rides on the rip fence, and with the blade tipped to the right angle, usually about 15 degrees, you take the blank stock, which is usually 3/4 of an inch thick, run it through to do an edge, flip it over, make sure it's against the stop, run it through again. 4 passes gives you a raised panel. Now, the key is to have enough height so that this will be perfectly vertical, and also to have some ability to clamp the pieces so that it's safe to push them through. Let me show you how we make one. We'll start by breaking out the panel cutter. I like to build a lot of the jigs I use out of this MDO plywood, the 3/4 inch thick stock. It has a nice smooth surface and very few voids, and it seems to be pretty stable. Now the first thing I want to do is take this 16-inch wide piece, square one end, and then cut it to length. Okay, now I want the piece to be 28 inches long. Put a mark there, spin it around, line it up with the fence, and cut it. These holes are needed for the bar clamp slots. I'm starting to cut the slots with the table saw. I'll finish them with my handheld jigsaw. Now I can install the stop, a piece of 1.5 inch wide, 3/4 inch plywood, and even though I know my panel is square, I'm still going to use my framing square to confirm it. Set that in place, tack it with some brads, and permanently attach it with some screws. The next challenge is to take this part of the jig and find a way to secure it to the fence so it remains vertical, yet slides along the fence easily. Each manufacturer will create a different situation to deal with. This is the Unifence. It has a heavy aluminum extrusion. On the original that I built, I put a spacer equal to the top of the extrusion, a little filler that would squeeze against the thinner part, and finally another piece of 3/4 inch plywood, and that slides along the fence pretty nice. Now if you happen to have a Biesmeyer fence, which has 2 flat sides, it gets a little bit simpler. I would take some pieces of plywood, of course they would be the same length as the jig, and create a right angle like this, which would form a box that drops over the fence. If you have a standard issue fence, the idea is the same, except that the box becomes a little bit smaller. Now to finish up our jig, I'm going to bring the panel over to the saw, set it right on the table, and take a piece of cherry that I've planed down to the same thickness as the top of the extrusion and attach it with a couple brads. Now I've got another piece of 3/4 inch plywood that goes on the other side of that filler. And I'll just clamp it in place for now. That slides pretty good. Now I've taken another piece of stock and thinned it down so that it fits between the piece of plywood I just clamped on and the extrusion. This will allow me to put a couple pencil marks on. I'll take the thing apart and glue, brad, and screw it together. And finally, some holes for screws that will pull the sandwich together. Okay. That works great. Now let's make a raised panel. I'm going to use a piece of 5/8" straw board, and I've tipped my saw blade to 10 degrees, and I do the narrow ends of the panel first. Once the saw stops, I can pull it back through, turn it on another side. 4 passes will make a panel. All right, just a couple minutes, a raised panel. This is going to be a very useful jig. Last season I built this piece. It's called an English server, and it has tapered legs, which give the piece a little bit of lightness and grace. The way that I make the tapered leg is to use this tapering jig. It's a couple pieces of plywood with a hinge at one end. At the other end, there's a stop block, and then this adjustment bar, which gives me quite a range of different angles. It's very difficult to taper legs freehand, and this works great. Now, one of the things I've discovered in using this jig is that the side that I put the stock against sometimes gets bowed, and it's also pretty flexible. So I'm going to stiffen that in the one we build now. I'm going to use a piece of this heavy-duty 1/8" thick aluminum angle, which I can buy at my home center or hardware store. I'm going to set it on what will become the bottom edge of that leg, clamp it in place, and drill some holes for some screws. Now we'll switch to a countersink for the head of the screw. Okay, that takes care of that. Now I need to make a counterbore for the head of the bolt which operates the adjustment arm. That only has to be about 3/16 of an inch deep. Here I've switched to a 1/4 inch diameter bit to do the through hole. Now the pivot hinge. And I'm just going to pre-drill some holes for the screws. Here I've just rounded over the ends of the adjustment bar. Now I'll sand them smooth. Here I've drilled a 5/16 inch hole at each end of the slot for the adjustment bar. I'll clean it out with my jigsaw. I'm going to fix one end of the spreader to the side of the jig that rides up against the rib fence with a 1.5 inch screw. And now I can take this 4.5 inch long carriage bolt, drive that through the hole, flip the jig over, install a fender washer and a wing nut. Here I'm applying a stop to one end of the jig. All right, let's give it a try. The jig goes up against the rib fence. A piece of square stock, which might be a leg, goes up against the stop. First thing I do is set the bevel that I want, and in this case I'll just do it by eye, about that amount. Now the first part of the leg I'm going to want square where it might meet a rail, so we'll leave that part way up, slide the whole assembly over, back it away, and make a pass. That's one side of a tapered leg. Now to make the other side, I just turn the leg over 90 degrees and run it through. Well, there you have it, a tapered leg. That's going to be a handy jig. Several years ago, I built this carousel table. Nice spinning carousel in the middle and plenty of room around the edge for place settings. Now, you might think it's difficult to cut these nice circles for the top, that you have to lay it out and then use a jigsaw to cut it freehand and try to sand it so it looks nice and round. Well, there's a way to get perfectly round tops easily using a circle cutting jig on your bandsaw. Now, this is the original jig made out of some 3/4-inch plywood, and it's held together with some screws that sort of squeeze it onto the bandsaw table. It's supported on the far end by this woodworkers rolling support. Now, how it works is that I would drill a hole along the center line for whatever the radius of the top would be, and you move the pin to the hole that I want, have a hole in the top, and just spin it around. Now, as I've found with jigs, over the years, there's always improvements that can be made. So I think it's time to make a new circle cutting jig. I'm going to start out with another piece of 3/4-inch MDO plywood. It's MDO on one side. It's as wide as the bandsaw table, and it's about 42 inches long. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is attach this hardwood strip, which will go in the miter gauge slot of the bandsaw. And you may have to adjust yours to go in the right position and make the piece fit snugly in the slot. Let's look at the old jig. As you can see, I've drilled several different holes for the radii of the different projects. Sooner or later, I'm going to run out of holes. It would be nice to have an infinite setup from here to the end. And that's what I'm going to do on the new jig. I've set up my router with a straight cutting bit and my guide fence, and I'm going to make a dado for a nut. The idea here is to make the slot just wide enough for this nut, because I don't want it to spin. So I'll have to readjust my fence and make another pass. Okay, that's perfect. Now the nut won't spin when I tighten the screw. During the last few minutes, I've made a couple changes to my router. I've installed a smaller diameter bit, this time 1/4 inch, and I've readjusted my fence so that I can make a through slot right down the center of that dado. Let me show you how this works. What I have is a 1/4 inch bolt with a straight slot screw head. That goes in from the underside. Then I put the nut on, get it started, and then I can slip it into that dado and tighten it up the rest of the way. I dog it down nice and tight with a screwdriver, but the advantage is that I can move it up and down this slot for quite a range of different radius cuts. Now I'm just going to take a couple little blocks of plywood and these pieces of hardwood and create a little pocket into which I'll be able to put a leg. Good. Now let me show you where that's going to go. Just going to position it right on the end of the jig, and I'll attach it with a few screws. Now the way this works is that a piece of 6-inch, 3/4-inch plywood fits in that pocket, and then I have a leg. Now I may not need the leg for every single tabletop, but for large heavy ones, it's going to come in handy. Okay, now what I've done is made a cut in the jig. I simply placed that hardwood strip that I installed earlier in the miter gauge slot and made a pass through the saw. And what that gives me is a piece of material out here which will support the waste material as I cut tabletops. The next thing to do is to attach the jig to the cast iron table. So I'm going to clamp it in place and then drill some holes all the way through the plywood and the metal. The first pass with the drill was just a pilot hole. Now I'm going to a larger bit. I put a little bit of oil for lube, and I drill all the way through. Now I'm going to tap it for this bolt that I'm going to use to secure the top. Using a tap that you can buy at any hardware store. I just start it in with a little bit of a turn, feel it bite, back it off to get the waste out, turn in a little more, and so forth until we get all the way through. Okay, now if you didn't want to go through this process, you could drill a hole large enough to put a through bolt with a nut. Okay, that's great. That's not going anywhere. Let's try it out. Let's make a 30-inch cafe tabletop out of this piece of melamine. So what I want to do is measure over from one edge 15 inches, which is the actual radius that I'm going to work with. Then I want to take the other dimension and divide it roughly in half, which is about 15.5 inches. And I'll drill a 1/4-inch pilot hole, but not all the way through, just enough to pick up that pin. Now I just butt my tape measure up against the bandsaw blade, slide the pin over so that it's centered at 15 inches, and tighten it down. Okay, now I just drop that pilot hole right over the pin, turn it on, and spin the blank. Well, that works great. A perfect circle every time. Well, once again, I'm working at my shop-built router station. It's one of the most popular projects we've ever built here at the workshop. And one of the things that makes it perform so well and safely are these featherboards. They help hold the stock down to the table and up against the fence. They're very simple, pine boards with a series of slots cut in them. And if I rub my hand under it, you can see that they're very flexible, so they hold the stock down. They also keep it from kicking out. Now, the piece that I just ran was this bead detail. Without the featherboards, there's a possibility that the piece would lift up off the table, and then it would ruin the bead. This way, I'm guaranteed a perfect cut. I think it's time that we make up a few new ones. Well, I've taken some scrap pieces of poplar that I've had here at the workshop and laid out a few featherboards. This large one is going to be for the table saw so that I can clamp it. A new vertical one for the shaper and a horizontal one. Now for the layout, I've put a 30-degree angle on the end of each piece. And for the spacing of the cuts for the featherboard, I just took a piece of scrap wood about 1/8 of an inch thick and laid out a whole series of lines. And a 1/2-inch hole through each featherboard so I can hang it on the wall. Okay, let's give these a test drive. Well, they work great. Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. Last time you saw us build some of our favorite woodworking jigs, including the panel cutting jig, the panel raising jig, and the tapering jig. This time we're going to build several more, including the box joint jig that I used to make this desktop writing case. That and more, next, right here on the new Yankee Workshop. Let's start with a jig that we used when we built this break front cabinet recently. It's one to drill the adjustable shelf pin holes. There are holes 1 inch on center that take these little support pins. Now it's critical that all the holes be level so that the shelf will be level. I made the holes in that break front using a very simple jig, just a piece of plywood with a series of holes. That jig was inspired by a commercially made one that was sent to us by a friend of the show. And that created quite a stir on the website. People wanted to know where to get this or how to build their own jig. Now today, we're going to build a new Yankee version. With use, there are always improvements that can be made. Now if you'd like the plans for this jig or any of the other ones we're going to build today, or we've done over these two special programs, a measure drawing is available, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. For our new jig, I'm starting with a piece of 1/2 inch cabinet-grade plywood, 8 inches wide, 36 inches long. I've laid out a center line, which will be used when we actually use the jig, but it's also the layout for everything else. There's another line along this direction, and the first step is to drill some holes for this collar, which goes in the router, and there'll be 1 inch on center all the way down this line. To make those holes, I've set up my drill press with a 5/8 inch Forstner bit. I've put a piece of plywood on the base so the bit won't hit the metal, and I've set up a fence. Square back from the bit is a line on the fence, and that's my index. I'll drill a hole right there in the center, slide it 1 inch, drill a hole, and continue until I get all the holes I need. But before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. The Forstner bit is a good choice here, because it won't tear out the plywood on the back side, particularly with the backer board. Here I've switched to a 1/4 inch bit, and I'm drilling 1 hole at each end of the jig. And what that's for is to register the jig if I need a series of holes greater than the ones that the jig can do. And I'll show you how that works in a little while. Let's look at the differences between the old jig and the new jig. First of all, the new jig is wider. The line of holes on the new jig is closer to one edge, but not so close that I won't have good support from my router. Now this extra width is going to give me an adjustment feature. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If I was to take this piece of mahogany plywood that was left over from our kitchen secretary, which also has adjustable shelves, and I wanted to make this into a wall cabinet with a series of holes, the first thing I do is divide the height in half and put a line right at the center. That becomes the key for the jig, which also has a center line. Almost all these jigs have a center line. Now for the distance in from the edge for the series of holes, on this jig I simply used pencil marks. This is 1.5 inches, this is 2, this is 2 1/4. So let's say I'm going to use 1.5 inches. I've got to line up this end, the middle, and the other end, and then clamp it in place. And that can be a little time consuming. On the commercial jigs they have a pin in 1/4 inch increments to set that distance. I would like to have a finer adjustment, so what I'm going to do is cut a slot here so that we can mount a bar underneath and have a good range of adjustment. So I've put a straight edge clamp across the piece, set up the router with a 1/4 inch bit. Distance from the center of the router to the edge is equal to the jig to the layout, and I'm just going to cut a slot all the way through. Okay, now we'll flip the jig around and make the same hole on the other end. The only other part of this jig is the stop, just a piece of 3/4 inch plywood that I cut a little bit longer than the jig itself. It's about 1/4 inch on each end. I'll hold it flush with the side, and then just take a pencil and mark the slot so that I can drill a hole for the bolt I'm going to use. For a reference, I'm going to put marks every 1/4 inch at each end. And these vertical lines will make it a lot easier to adjust the stop. To attach the stop to the main part of the jig, I'm just using a 1/4 inch carriage bolt. We'll drop that down through the slot and spin it around so the square part of the carriage bolt is in the slot. Take a wing nut and use that to lock it down. Well, let's try it out and make some holes in this piece of plywood, which could be for a mythical cabinet. I've set the stop so that it's 1.5 inches from the center of my holes. Just run that up against the side of the piece, come to the middle, line up the center points, and then clamp the whole assembly to my workbench. I've installed the collar in my router, and I have a 1/4-inch spiral bit. The depth is set so that it'll cut a 1/2 inch into the plywood. I start at one end, work my way down. Okay, I'm going to pop off the clamps, and we have a nice series of holes evenly spaced. Now to do the other side, I just turn the piece around, set it up again, and do the same thing. Now let's suppose this side piece was twice as long, say for a pantry cabinet. All I do then is slide the jig down until I get it where I want it, take a 1/4-inch dowel pin and slip it in one of the holes that's already been drilled, and now I know it's set in the right position and I can continue to make shelf pin holes. We'll be using this jig a lot. One of the appealing things about our desktop writing case is the joinery at the corners. These are called box joints. You might have seen them on old cigar boxes or cream cheese boxes, even saw them on boxes that held hardware. It's a beautiful joint and it's very strong because of all these surface areas where you can put glue. Very easy to make box joints with a jig at your table saw. You take the miter gauge, attach a piece of plywood to it, which has a pin and a slot, and then you have a loose gauge that matches the thickness of the slot and this pin. And your dado head set at 3/8 of an inch. Let's make another jig. I start out with a piece of the 3/4-inch MDO, and I've put a pencil line that's exactly 3/4 of an inch from the left-hand end. I bring that pencil line even with the end of my miter gauge and put a pencil mark for one of the screws. Almost all miter gauges have a place for screws. Now I just pre-drill the hole and attach it to the miter gauge. Just one pan head screw. The height of the dado is just a little over 3/4 of an inch. Let's make one pass through the back. The next step is critical. I want to take a piece of solid wood and make a pin that fits that slot exactly. It can't be too loose. So I've removed the dado head, but left the height adjustment the same because I'm going to need the dado back in there in a minute. And I've set the fence for what should be an exact fit. Now let's see how we did. I'd say that is just right. We'll just shorten this stick a bit to make that pin. Now I'll just slip that pin in the slot, pre-drill a hole, and attach it with a screw. Okay, now what I want to do is remove the jig from the miter gauge and slide it over 3/4 of an inch and reattach it. And once again, I'm going to pre-drill the holes. With the jig reattached, I can make the second slot. All right, let's give it a try. Here are a couple pieces of scrap plywood that I'm going to join at the corner with box joints. Now the first step is to take one of the pieces and the gauge, which is the same width as the pin, put it up against the pin and make a pass. Now I remove this gauge, slide this piece over so that it's over the pin, take the adjoining piece, run it up against the pin, put a clamp to hold the pieces together, and make the next pass. Now it's just a matter of sliding the piece over, dropping it on the pin, making a pass until we get all the way across. Okay, let's give it a try. That's good. Not too tight, not too loose. Perfect box joints. This jig is going to come in handy. A few years ago, I built this marble roll, a series of chutes with holes that you can run marbles or balls down, and the kids love it. Now, to cut this catcher, which is a round piece, I made a jig for my router. I actually took a piece of 1/4-inch plywood and just screwed it to the router base. And to cut the circle, I just drove a screw at the diameter that I wanted, and I would just pivot the whole thing around, the router doing the work. Now, you can make these jigs any size you want. You can make one big enough to cut a tabletop. I think I can make some improvements on this one. So what I've done is started out with a rectangular piece of plywood, 3/8 of an inch thick, and I've laid out a center line. I've also taken the time to take the router base and lay out the holes for the screws that I'm going to use to attach it. Now, the sides will be tapered eventually, but before I do that, I want to cut a slot right down the middle for this nut. To do that, I'm using my router with a 3/8 inch straight cutting bit, and I've adjusted my rip fence so that it'll be right in the center. The next step is to cut a hole for the router bit to pass through, so I've set up a 1 1/4 inch Forstner bit. I'm changing bits here to a 3/16 inch diameter to drill the through holes for the screws. I've flipped the piece over to the other side, and this countersink will accept the screw head. Now at last, we'll cut the half circle and the tapers. Now I just take these 3/4 inch wide pieces of plywood, and I'm going to nail those on to create a slightly narrower slot for the bolt. Okay, now for the pivot point, I'm going to use a small carriage bolt that goes through the narrow slot from the top, and then I put a nut on the underside. Now, when the nut is down in the lower slot, it can't turn as I tighten the screw. I can set the pin any place that I want. Using the screws that came with the standard router base, I simply attach the jig. Okay, let's make a test cut. I've got a piece of 3/4 inch plywood here that's about 14 1/4 inches wide. So I'll put a mark right about in the center. I'm going to cut a 14 inch diameter circle. Now I'll take a 1/4 inch brad point bit and drill a hole partway through. Now for the setup on the jig, I've torqued down the pin so that it's 7 inches from the center of the pin to this leading edge of the bit. Now I drop the pin over that reference hole, and a couple times around should cut all the way through. Okay, that's all there is to it. A few years ago, I made this teak bar, and it featured louvered doors. Now, I can't go to the home center and buy louvered doors made out of teak. This is a custom item. The trick to making louvered doors is to make slots in the stiles of the door that are perfectly matched. Otherwise, the slats are not going to be straight. That takes either a specialty machine or a jig, which is what I did. And the jig will allow me to cut both sides at the same time, making a perfect match. Now, how it works is that I use a router with a collar and a 1/4 inch bit, and the collar rides in these V-shaped slots. It would be nearly impossible to cut nice, crisp slots in the middle of a piece of plywood. But if you're willing to cut the jig in half and start with 2 pieces, I can lay it out, drill holes, and cut slots for the template. So the first thing I'm going to do is tack these 2 pieces together. Next, I'm going to drill some 1/2 inch holes, 2 inches on center, using this line on my fence as an indexing point. Using my bevel gauge, which I've set this inside angle to be 25 degrees, I'm extending lines from the hole out to the edge. The best tool to cut out this material to the hole is the band saw. If I used a circular saw, it would overcut. I don't want to do this freehand. I want very accurate cuts. Now, if I try to use my miter gauge to angle it, it doesn't go far enough back, and I can only turn it to 30 degrees for a setting, and that's not enough because I need 25. Now, if I was to take the miter gauge and turn it around, I get a little bit closer to the blade, but I'm still limited by 30 degrees. So what I'm going to do is go back to 90 and make a little jig that'll give me a 25-degree angle. The first part of that jig is this piece of plywood, which I'll clip off one end at 25 degrees. Here I'm attaching a narrow piece of plywood to that angled piece. Now this long, narrow piece will become the new fence. And now a couple screws to attach the jig to the miter gauge. The first pass will be to clip off some excess on this fence. Now I can use the intersection of the fence and that angle as a reference point to cut out the material to each hole. At this point, I can pop the pieces apart, turn them face to face or edge to edge, and then clamp them together. Here I'm applying some glue on the underside for this 1.5 wide strip of plywood, which goes between these lines, which are 3/4 of an inch from the joint. I'll secure the piece with some brads. Now I'll install these hardwood strips on each side of that 1/4 inch plywood, and that's where we'll sandwich the stiles when we route the slots. With the dado set at 1/4 of an inch, I've just made 2 grooves, and they're going to be for some stops. I'll show you where we use those later. I've installed the 1/2 inch collar on the router and installed a bit. Now I want to plunge through the 1/4 inch strip. Okay. Well, that did a pretty good job. Here I've clamped a couple pieces of pine in my side vise. These would be the stiles of a door. I've put a pencil mark right here, which is where the bottom rail will come in, and that's where I want the first louver slat to start. So I take the jig, drop it over the 2 stiles, and then I have to slide it until I get the pencil mark that I just made right at the bottom of the cutout in that 1/4 inch plywood, right there. Then I'll put a clamp to secure it. Now I'm going to take this piece of 1/4 inch plywood and slip it in the left-hand groove. The idea is to take the router with the collar and start at the bottom of these right-hand slots. Keep pressure against the long side of each V-shaped piece and run it forward until the base hits that stop. I'll make all the slots in one style, move the stop, and do the corresponding style. That's good. Now I'll move the stop to the other side of the jig and route the corresponding style. Now I can pop off the jig, and you can see that I have mirror image slots for the slats every 2 inches. What I want to do now is put a slot every inch. So I take my square, which is 1 inch wide, go to my original mark, move it up 1 inch, reset the jig, go through the same process. Okay, and there you have two perfectly matched styles for louver slats. One of the earliest projects I built here at the new Yankee Workshop was this shaker wall clock. It's a reproduction of the one made by Brother Isaac Hayes out at the Hancock Shaker Village over 100 years ago. When he built his, he mortised for the hinges with a chisel and a mallet. When I built this one, I mortised for the hinges with a jig and a router. Now the jig is fairly simple, just a piece of plywood with a stop and a little cutout that relates to the size of the hinge. Now there are a lot of different types of hinges, and that means I need an individual jig for each one. There are commercial versions available and they'll handle most sizes, but I like to make my own because it doesn't take very long. Now over here I have a door clamped in the side vise, and I want to tell you why we mortise for the hinge. The hinge mortise makes the hinge flush with the edge of the door. That's the correct procedure. What that does is closes the gap between the door and the face frame. But more importantly, the hinge, this little pocket, provides an edge so the door hangs on these very shallow shoulders rather than just on the screws themselves. Now let's suppose I have a room full of doors to do. Now I want to make a jig, and it's simple enough. I start out with a router with a 5/8 inch diameter collar and a 3/8 inch diameter bit. That means that the bit is 1/8 of an inch smaller than the collar. So I take a piece of plywood and I lay out for the hinge 1/8 of an inch bigger on 3 sides. I'll remove this material over at the table saw. Cutting this notch accurately is a very important part of making this jig, and it's not a problem if you have a table saw. It's really the only way you can do it. I wouldn't try to cut it with a jigsaw, and I wouldn't cut it on the bandsaw. What I want to do is bring it in using my miter gauge and nibble away the material. Okay, that takes care of the notch. I've got 1/8 of an inch all the way around to accommodate the collar on the router. And now what I want to do is just take a couple pieces of 1/4 inch plywood and nail those on as a stop. Well, let's give it a try. I clamp the jig with its center line aligning with the center line of the mortise, and I simply route it out. I'm cleaning the corners out using my corner chisel. I could certainly do it with a conventional chisel. Let's just slide the hinge in place. That's the way it should look. Jigs. Where would we be without them?